Joining us now on set, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. Very good to have you on the set with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Your take on President Trump's address before the UN General Assembly. What's your gut?
Well, my gut is I'm glad he went and that he actually spoke some positive things about the United Nations. I think it was actually two speeches. One in which somebody had written about the history of the UN and the importance of it, and the other written in a way to be much more nationalistic. I think kind of going up and talking about America first in that location. And then having listened to many speeches there, the tone of it was really bad, I think. And in so many ways, I think we all want to make sure that America's strong, but I think his speech weakened America, and I think was something that is going to make it very hard for us to carry on a lot of diplomatic work that we have to. But I'm going to try to be positive, and see that the fact that he recognizes the importance of some multilateral action and the history of the UN, because the UN's important, and part of it is going to be now as to whether they fund the UN. By not paying or funding, it's very hard to get reform if, in fact, you don't support the funding of it. So those are the aspects of it.
We talk around the table often about how maybe a slight move to the middle by Donald Trump is always met with a harsh tweet where he throws red meat to his base. Did you get a sense yesterday that the two speeches he gave, one may have been sort of a tip of the hat to the United Nations and an understanding of the realities that have set in on him over the past 8 months, but another part of the speech might have been for domestic consumption, for his base, saying, yes, yes, I'm at the United Nations, but my friends, don't worry, I'm going to say national sovereignty 1,000 times, so you can take that back to your Republican club meetings and let them know Donald's still with you.
I think you're absolutely right. And, you know, mostly you don't go to the UN to give a domestic speech. And I think that he was doing that, red meat in so many ways, but it will hurt ultimately. Right. And in terms of the multilateral, I know people don't like the word multilateralism. It has too many syllables and ends in an ism, but mostly it is about partnerships and sharing the burden. And I think that then he has to do that kind of work. And then I do think the language generally that he used was so harsh that I think it, in some ways, it strengthened Kim Jong-un, made him the center of attention.
Yep.
Richard, you were laughing,
totally agree with
sort of
that.
laughing when I was talking about domestic consumption. I take it that you agree that, but because people need to understand, for Donald Trump's hard base, the 33%, him stepping in to the United Nations is a statement.
100%.
Is a betrayal.
Right. The UN is the great symbolism in that world.
Right.
And there's a lot of literature about ultimately it'll take away American sovereignty, ultimately take away the Second Amendment rights. So for him to go to the UN is totally inconsistent with the ethos of his base. And it wasn't a coincidence that he used the word sovereignty 21 times. That was his way of reassuring people that he's not going to be taken in by the fact that he's showing up in New York and at this body.
Secretary Albright, the North Korean problem is one you confronted as ambassador to the UN and then as Secretary of State. The president said if that nation continued its pursuit of a nuclear weapon, he would, quote, totally destroy North Korea, or at least that the U.S. had the capability to do that. A very pretty specific threat. Where are we? What are we left with now, 25 years or so after you all first confronted the problem of North Korea? What hasn't worked for a generation and what's left?
Well, let's just say it is there's no question it's a difficult issue. But during the Clinton administration, there was no addition of fissile material, no nuclear weapons, and no ICBMs. And we were in the middle of negotiations when I left there in October, presented it when the Bush administration had won the election, and Secretary Powell was willing to continue the negotiations, and they didn't. So they're any number. It's the most complicated history I've ever seen. But what is left are all the tools in the toolbox, and there has to be a better whole of government approach to it and working within the six-party talks. We can't just decide that diplomacy does not work. because I do think that they need to do more with the sanctions and they need to do more with diplomacy, and we have to have deterrence. I fully agree, but to put it into kind of DEFCON highest now, I think is something that is very troubling, because it makes it difficult for anybody to talk to them, and we do have to, talking to somebody you don't like is actually more important.
Critics would say that we've ratcheted up sanctions over and over and over again for 20, 25 years now, and there's no response from North Korea except to continue its pursuit of North Korea. I'm not calling for a military strike. I'm just asking if you believe that sanctions actually will solve this problem.
I don't think they'll solve the problem, but I do think that looking at what is available, I think what will ultimately, the six-party talks obviously talk about what the Chinese need to do. And then I find interesting the fact that if he did, in fact, explode more thermonuclear weapon, that there was news about the fact that some radioactive material had gone into the airspace of China and the Russians, and I think that that is something that they are afraid of. And Richard, you had talked about the fact 5 nuclear powers, but I think that the Non-Proliferation Treaty works to the extent that it does because people understand they don't want radioactive over their territory.
David Ignatius is going to jump in from Washington. David?
Secretary Albright, you and I have talked often over the last month about whether the liberal international order, as we often call it, can survive the Trump presidency. And I'm curious, after this major speech at the United Nations by Donald Trump, do you feel that's more or less likely?
I think that it's much more complicated because, in fact, in order to have a liberal order, you do need to work with the other countries. And he had not made clear enough. Sovereignty is one word, but I think in terms of what governments are like, how you, in fact, talk to your own people without riling them all up, and then looking at what the institutions are that you can work with. The press, the judiciary, and we have spent a lot of time thinking about this, you and I and others, and I think I am worried. And sovereignty is a very important part, but the question, and Richard is the expert on a lot of sovereignty, what are the obligations of sovereignty? How do you work with others? And what is our responsibility towards other countries?
Secretary Albright, let me ask you really briefly, just about the United Nations generally. 25 years later, I think about 25 years after you said the UN must reform or die, you saw it up close. 25 years later, we've seen Syria unravel, and the United Nations and the international order couldn't bring that chaos to an end. We've seen North Korea continue its march over the past 25 years, and we're at a stage now, again, where nothing meaningful can be put together by an international community. What do you say to Americans? What do you say to members of the United Nations about its ineffectiveness over, let's just say, the past year? And how does it become more effective in international affairs again?
I think one thing that we do have to keep in mind, it is a combination, a collection of nation states. Sovereignty is the important part, and we can blame the Secretariat and international bureaucrats, but ultimately it is a decision by the nation states. And the United States, and this was my problem when I was there, we were behind in paying our peacekeeping bills, and then Congress unilaterally decided to lower the amount we were going to pay, and it's very hard to call for reform if you're not paying, leading the British, our best friends actually, to deliver a message they'd waited over 200 years to say, representation without taxation. And we do, in fact, have to make it work. The new Secretary General Guterres is somebody who's bound and determined to move forward on a reform. And then the cliche, if it didn't exist, we'd invent it. It is a necessary way of having countries operate together and find common goods. But I do think also, one thing that I've been pushing for a lot, the private sector has to be at the table early. Public-private partnership and working on some of these problems is important. You can't bring them in at the last minute, and there needs to be a way to reform the UN. There's no question. But in order for us to push that agenda, we have to believe that it can be done.
Secretary Madeleine Albright, it's great to have you on the show. She's trying to be positive, Joe.
She is trying to be positive.
Trying.
And of course, We need the CFR right there.
Yes,
Always.
by her side.
Just critical, Richard.
It's always good to see
Very
you.
good.
Thank you
so much.
Coming up
Yeah.
from one former Secretary of State to another, John Kerry joins the table. And we continue to keep an eye on Puerto Rico as Hurricane Maria is battering the island right now with 155-mile-per-hour winds. We'll be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.